All right, welcome to your next project. So in this one, we're going to build a simple login form here with a wave effect on the labels. So if I go ahead and I click in here in the input, you can see the label will then wave up. Okay, so we have that cool little animation when we click in here and when we click out. So basically the way we're going to do this is wrap a span around each one of these using JavaScript and add a transition so that the label moves up when we focus on the input, but we're also going to add a dynamic transition delay so it gives it that wave effect. So each letter goes up at a different time. All right, so that's what we'll be doing. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so let's get started on our form input wave project. I have my project starter open here. I'm just going to say form input wave. And then let's get rid of this H1 and we're just going to wrap a container around our form. So we'll have a container with an H1. We'll just say please log in. It's just a basic login form. And we'll have a form tag here. We don't need an action. And in here we're going to have a form-control, which will wrap around the input, which is going to be type text. I'm also going to add required, which will just give it some basic validation. And then the label is going to go underneath, and we don't really need a for, so we'll get rid of that and say email. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy that down, and this one is going to be password. So type password and label password. Underneath that form control, we're going to have a button, and I'm going to give it a class of btn, and let's just say login. And then we'll have a div with the class of text. Actually, let's do we'll do a paragraph with a class of text and say don't have an account. And if they don't have an account, then we'll just have a link, doesn't have to go anywhere, and say register. All right, so that's our form. Pretty simple. Now, before I get into the CSS, I just want to kind of explain what we're going to be doing as far as, how to do this. And we want to use JavaScript to basically wrap each letter in a span, and we're going to have a transition on that span to move it up. So, or a transform translate Y value to move it up with a transition to make it smooth. And in JavaScript, when we wrap the span around each letter, we're also going to add a transition delay to each one that increases every letter, so that the first one goes up, and then the M would be delayed, then it would go up, A would be even more delayed, then it would go up. So it gives it that wave effect. So that's ultimately what we're going to end up with. In fact, I'll go ahead and just paste in what these labels will look like afterwards. So basically we'll have the label tag. You don't have to put this in. I'm just showing you as an example. We'll have each letter wrapped in a span with a transition delay that increments. So I'm just going to comment that out, but just so you can see what we're going to end up with. But before we get into any of that, let's just do some basic styling on this form because it looks horrible. So I'm going to use the Mully font. So we'll do family equals MULI, and then let's set that on the body. And then I'm going to set a background color for the body to steel blue, and the color of the text to white. That, and then let's style, let's see, we'll do the container, and let's add a background color of RGBA. I want it to have just kind of a transparent look, so black, and then 0.4 for the alpha value. And let's add padding. So padding, we're going to do 20 pixels top and bottom, 40 left and right. And let's add a slight border radius of 5 pixels. All right, and then let's do container H1. So for that, I want to text align to the center. I also want to add a margin on the bottom of 30 pixels. Okay, and then the link, let's say container A, which is just the register link. I want to text decoration none. Take away the underline, and the color will be, let's set the color to light blue. So now we want to get into the form fields. First we have the form control, which wraps around the input and the label. So let's say form control, and I'm going to position that relative because I want the label to be positioned absolute within it. And then for margin, let's do 20 top and bottom, 0 left and right, 40 bottom. And I'm going to just set a width of 300 pixels. All right, and then let's do the inputs. So form control input. I'm going to set the background color to transparent and then get rid of that border. But I do want a border on the bottom. Oops. So let's say border, border dash bottom, and I'm going to set that to 2 pixels. Let's do white and solid. Okay, now I want it on its own line, so instead of inline, we want to display block. I also want it to go all the way across, so we'll set width to 100%. And we'll add some padding. Let's do 15 pixels on the top and bottom. And the font size for the input, I'm going to set to 18 pixels. And I think we should be good there. Let's set the color to white. And then the border here, or the outline I should say, we want to get rid of that. Also, if I submit and it's invalid, you get that border as well. So let's target form control input, and when it's in its focus, also we want form control input valid. And we're going to just set the outline on that to 0. Okay, so now we don't have that ugly border. Now, before we do it, I think we're going to do the label stuff in the next video, but let's finish like the button and the text down here. So we have a class of, actually we'll put this up, we'll do all the form stuff down at the bottom. So let's do btn, and I'm just going to set the cursor to a pointer. I'm going to display as an inline block for our button here, and I want it to go all the way across, so we'll say width 100%, and let's set the background of the button to light blue, and let's set the padding, we'll do padding 15 pixels, and let's, for font family, we're going to inherit, and then for font size, let's set that to 16 pixels. And the border, we want to get rid of that, so border 0, and I'm going to make the border radius the same as the container, 5 pixels. And I think that's all we want to do. Let's say btn focus, set that outline. Actually, we can add that down here. No, because we're going to add something else there. Yeah, let's just do outline 0 on btn focus. And we can have a little hover effect too. So, I mean, not hover, click effect or hover, whatever you want. So we're going to do button, and when it's active, so when we click down on it, we're going to add a transform and just scale it down a bit. So scale it from 1 to 0.98. So we get that little effect. All right. Yeah, so I think, what else? The text here, we can move that down a little bit. So under the button stuff, we have a class of text. And I'm just going to set the margin top to 30 pixels. Push that down a bit. Now, the label, don't worry about that. We're gonna style that next. And like I said, we need to use JavaScript to turn the label into letters with spans around them with a transition delay. We're also going to add a transition, obviously, on the label span. So we'll get into that in the next video. Okay, so we're going to finish this form up. So I'm going to work on the labels here. So down here, we'll just take form control labels, and we want to position those to be absolute. And absolute, and that's because the form control itself is relative, so we're positioning absolute within that. And we're going to put from the top 15 pixels and from the left 0. Now right now the way it is, if I start to type in here, it's going to just cover the label, but ultimately the label is going to wave upwards when we click in here. Alright, now before we actually style the span, I want to add it because right now there is no span. You know, we don't have this, it's just label and then the word. So we're going to use JavaScript to basically turn this into this. So let's jump into our script.js, and first thing we want to do is bring in our labels. So let's use document.querySelectorAll, because it doesn't matter how many labels there are, we want to get them all. So form-control label, and that'll give us a node list of all the labels. So since it's a node list, we can go ahead and use for each on it, and we'll say for each label, for each label, I'm going to take the label.inner.html and set it. Now, first, there's a couple things we want to do. We want to get the inner text, inner text, which is just going to be, you know, each letter. So E, M, A, I, L in this case for the first one. And then I'm going to split it into an array. I'm going to go on to the next line and call .split. And what that does, if we put an empty string in here, is it splits the letters into an array. So it'll be an array with the first value will be E, the second will be M, and so on. Now from that, I want to manipulate it. So I'm going to use .map, which you can use on an array, which now this is, to turn it into an array of something else. And what we want to turn it into for now is an array of the letters with a span around it with a transition delay. So let's say map, and this just takes in an arrow function, and we're just going to use backticks here because we want to just turn it directly into an array of spans that we're going to have here, but we need to pass in here for each letter. And then I also want the index, which just starts at 0 and increments for every item in the array. And I want to turn it into, let's say, span. And inside here, we want to have whatever the letter is. So this will turn it into an array of letters with a span around it. Now, obviously, we don't want an array. We want it to be a string, so we can use join and just pass in an empty string, and that will turn it back into a string. Okay, so basically, we have the inner text. So we're looping through the label. We have the inner text E-M-A-I-L for the first one. We're splitting it into an array, which will put each letter in its own item in the array. Then we're mapping it to create an array of the letter with a span around it. Then we're turning it back into a string. So if I save this now, we don't see any difference here, but if I open up my Elements tab and I click on the label here, you'll see that now they're wrapped in spans. So I'm not going to add the transition delay just yet. Let's go back to our CSS, and now that we have these spans, we can add styling for it. So let's see. Let's do just the span in general first. So we'll say form control label span, and I'm going to display. Let's do display inline block. It's inline by default. And then I'm going to increase the font size to 18 pixels, because before this wouldn't have worked because we didn't have spans around them. And then let's do a min dash width of 5 pixels, and we're going to add a transition on this, because when we add the transform value, actually we'll add that first. So let's go up here, or down here rather, and let's say form control input focus. So focus meaning, you know, when we click inside, we want the direct label span, and we also want to do this on the validation. So I'll actually just copy this down, and we also want the valid state. So input valid. And what we'll do is just first of all change the color to light blue. So if I click in here, you can see the label turns light blue. I also want to turn the border light blue as well. So up here, where we did the outline on the input focus and valid, let's do bottom, or I'm sorry, bottom, border, bottom, and let's set that, or border bottom color rather, and set that to light blue. So that way when we click in here, both the border and the text here is light blue. Now, let's see, we want to move this up basically when we click in here. So to do that, we can add a transform, and we want to use translate Y because we're translating it. We're dealing with it on the Y axis. So translate Y, and I want to move it up, so it has to be a negative number. If I want to move it down, it would be positive. So let's do negative 30 pixels. So when I click in here, you can see they move up, and they just flicker up. It's not smooth, so that's why I'm going to add a transition onto the span right here. So let's say transition, and we'll do 0.3 seconds. And then we could do like an ease in, ease out. I'm going to use a cubic Bezier. So cubic Bezier. And then for the values here, basically what this is it defines a cubic Bezier defines a curve, and we can use it as a transition effect with a variable speed from start to end. And it takes in 4 points, which are P0, P1, P2, P3. P0 and P3 are the start and the end of the curve. So, I mean, it can get a lot more complicated if you're doing like really cool animations, but this is pretty simple. We're just going to do a couple values here, 0.68, negative 0.55, 0.265, and 1.55. So we'll have a variable speed on this transition. So if I click in here, you can see now it doesn't just flick up, it has that cool, almost like a bounce effect. Now we don't want the whole thing to go up at once. You could do that. I mean, you could leave it like that if you want, but I want to have that wave effect, so that's where the transition delay comes in. Because we already have the transition, and it's transitioning the this right here, the transform translate, where it moves up. So in our script here, let's add onto the span an inline style, and we'll set that to, let's say, transition dash delay. Now, when we set this, we don't want to set it to a fixed value because it'll do the same thing. It'll just wait and it'll flicker them all up at the same time. So what I'm going to do here is use the index, which just starts at 0, then 1, 2, 3, and so on, and I'm going to multiply it by 50. So the first one will be 0, second one 50, third one will be 150, then 200, 250, and so on. So now I'll save that, and if I click, okay, that didn't work. Oh, we need to add the milliseconds. So after the transition delay number, we need to have ms. All right, and there we go. And of course, you could change this, like we could do 30. We could do, 300, which is going to be very slow. So 300 milliseconds. I think that 50 is good though. You can make it faster, like 10. But you can barely see the wave. So I think 50 is a good number. So we'll keep it at 50 ms. All right, so that's how you can add this cool little effect. So that's it. Hopefully you guys like this project, and we'll move on to the next one.